Glenn Stewart Godwin. In the summer of 1987, a man crawled into a storm drain beneath one of California's most secure prisons, cut his way through a set of steel bars, and floated across the American River on a raft his own wife had helped prepare. That should have been the end of the story. Instead, it was only the halfway point. 4 years later, sitting in a Mexican prison and just days away from being handed back to the United States, Glenn Stewart Godwin disappeared a second time. More than 30 years have passed. No one has found him since. To understand how a man escapes 2 maximum security prisons on 2 sides of a border, you have to start with who he was before any of it. Godwin was born in Miami in the summer of 1958 and raised in Palm Springs, California. By most outward measures, he was unremarkable. He had graduated from the local high school, where he played trumpet in the band, and he'd worked a string of ordinary jobs, a mechanic here, a tool salesman there. But by the early 1980s, according to investigators, he was running a drug operation, and it was that hidden second life that pulled him toward the crime that would define everything after. On the 1st of August, 1980, Godwin and his roommate, a man named Frank Soto, lured a drug pilot named Kim Robert LaValle to their condominium. What happened inside was violent and deliberate. Godwin stabbed LaValle more than 24 times, then drove the body out into the desert and tried to destroy it with homemade explosives. Soto would later turn against him, agreeing to testify in exchange for a lighter outcome. And on the stand, he described Godwin in terms that stuck with everyone in the courtroom, calling him the most dangerous man he had ever met. So how does a first-time offender, convicted of a killing this brutal, end up walking free within a few years? The answer begins in early 1981, when Godwin was convicted of first-degree murder and robbery. Because he had no prior record, he was sentenced as a first-time offender to 25 years to life. On paper, that meant decades behind the walls of Folsom State Prison. In practice, Godwin had no intention of serving them. On the 28th of June, 1987, he made his move, and he did not do it alone. His wife, Shelley, and a former cellmate coordinated the plan from the outside. Godwin used the prison's own drainage system against it, crawling through a storm drain, cutting through the bars at the end of it, and reaching the American River, where a raft was waiting. He crossed the water and slipped into the dark. The former cellmate who helped him was arrested not long after. Godwin was already gone, moving south toward Mexico, and the comparisons to a certain prison escape film would follow his case for years afterward. Here his story turned strange. Rather than lie low across the border, Godwin was arrested in Mexico later that same year on drug charges and locked up in a prison near Guadalajara. American authorities eventually learned where he was and began the slow work of arranging to bring him home. Then, in the spring of 1991, he was accused of killing a fellow inmate inside that Mexican prison. And on the 26th of September, 1991, only days before he was scheduled to be handed over to the United States, Godwin escaped again. Exactly how he got out has never been fully explained. What is certain is that he walked away from a second prison and vanished a second time, right out from under the authorities closing in on him. By now he had become one of the most wanted men in the country. In December of 1996, the FBI added Godwin to its 10 most wanted fugitives list, and his was the first case the Bureau ever illustrated on that list with a color photograph. His story became a regular feature of televised manhunt programs, profiled first in the late 1980s and again decades later when one of those shows was revived. Agents believed he had returned to Latin America and folded himself back into the drug trade, though they were careful never to rule out that he had slipped back into the United States. They noted that he was vain about his appearance, and may have altered it through plastic surgery, and that he had cycled through a long list of aliases, among them Michael Carrera and Dennis McWilliams. The FBI offered a reward of up to $20,000 for information leading to his capture. Even with all that national attention, the trail stayed cold. In May of 2016, after nearly 2 decades on the list, the FBI quietly removed him from it. That did not mean he had been cleared, and it did not mean he had been caught. The Bureau had simply concluded that keeping him in the spotlight was no longer bringing in the leads it once had. He remains a wanted fugitive, and the reward still stands. By the time he was taken off the list, Godwin had already been running for close to 30 years, longer than some of the agents assigned to his file had been with the Bureau. As of 2026, Glenn Stewart Godwin has never been recaptured. Investigators believe he is most likely somewhere in Central or South America, an American now in his 60s, living under one of the many names he has used. Still a step ahead of the people who have spent their careers looking for him. Godwin disappeared into a foreign country and simply stopped being found. A lone act of survival by a man with nothing behind him but his own nerve. The next fugitive got out under very different circumstances. This time the prisoner did no planning of her own. A group of people who believed she should never have been jailed came and broke her out themselves. Joanne Chesimard. For more than 40 years, the United States government hunted a single woman across 2 countries, placed a $2 million bounty on her head, and made her the first woman ever added to the FBI's most wanted terrorists list. They never got her. In September of 2025, Assata Shakur died in Havana, an elderly woman in the country that had sheltered her since the 1980s, and the long case against her closed the only way it ever really could, without her ever setting foot in an American courtroom again. Her story is one of the most divisive on this list, and to this day, people cannot agree on what she actually was. She was born Joanne Byron in Queens, New York, in the summer of 1947, and later took the name Assata Shakur. As a young woman, she attended community college and city college in New York, then moved into the radical politics of the era, joining the Black Panther Party and after it, the militant Black Liberation Army. The FBI regarded her as one of that group's central figures, once describing her as its revolutionary mother figure. To her supporters, she was an activist deliberately targeted by a federal program built to surveil and dismantle Black political movements. She was also, in a detail that would keep her name alive for a younger generation, the godmother of the rapper Tupac Shakur. Both versions of her, the militant and the martyr, would follow her for the rest of her life. On the 2nd of May, 1973, Shakur was riding in a car with 2 other members of the Black Liberation Army when New Jersey state troopers pulled them over on the turnpike. The stop turned into a shootout. When it ended, a state trooper named Werner Forster was dead. One of Shakur's companions was dead, another trooper was wounded, and Shakur herself had been shot. What happened in those few seconds has been argued over ever since. Prosecutors said she opened fire on the troopers. Shakur insisted she'd been shot with her hands raised and could not have fired a weapon at all. And her lawyers pointed out that tests found no gunpowder residue on her hands. If the evidence was genuinely in dispute, how did the case still end in a life sentence? It came down to a jury, and it came only after years of legal wrangling. Between 1973 and 1977, Shakur faced a string of separate indictments for other alleged crimes, and one after another, they fell apart, ending in 3 acquittals and 3 dismissals. But the trooper's death was different. In 1977, She was convicted of first-degree murder and 7 other felonies, and sentenced to life in prison. She would later insist in her own writing that the trial had been unfair from the start, that the outcome had been decided long before the verdict. A life sentence would have been the end of the road for almost anyone. Shakur was out of that prison in barely 2 years. On the 2nd of November, 1979, 3 members of the Black Liberation Army entered the New Jersey prison where she was held, took guards hostage, and walked her out. She went underground inside the United States, reportedly spending time in Pittsburgh, and for a while simply disappeared. Then, in 1984, she surfaced in Cuba, where Fidel Castro's government had granted her political asylum. She would live there, out of American reach, for the next 4 decades, publishing an autobiography and becoming a lasting emblem for later movements built around Black liberation. The people who broke her out did not get away clean. Several accomplices, among them Mutulu Shakur, Sylvia Baraldini, Sekou Odinga, and Marilyn Buck, were later convicted for their roles in the escape. But Shakur herself was untouchable, and over the years she grew into something far larger than the case itself. In 2013, the FBI made her the first woman ever placed on its most wanted terrorists list, and together with the state of New Jersey, raised the reward for her capture to $2 million. American administrations kept up the pressure, with a public demand for her return in 2017 and renewed extradition calls as recently as 2025. Cuba refused every time. Her presence in Havana became something much larger than one fugitive's freedom. For decades, she was a living symbol of everything that divided Washington and the island. A name raised in negotiations, a face on a wanted poster that never came down. Every American administration that tried to thaw relations with Cuba eventually ran into the question of what to do about Assata Shakur. And every time, the answer from Havana was the same. To her supporters, she was a hero of Black resistance, hounded by a government that had set out to destroy her movement. Police in New Jersey never saw her as anything but the person responsible for one of their own dying on that turnpike. In the end, the case closed for the plainest reason there is. Shakur grew old and died before anyone could bring her back to a courtroom. On the 25th of September, 2025, Cuba's foreign ministry announced that she had died in Havana at the age of 78, of what it described as health conditions and advanced age. Her daughter confirmed it. There was no relief in the response from New Jersey. The state's governor and the head of its state police both said she had died without ever being held fully accountable for the trooper's death. As of 2026, that $2 million reward was never collected, and reporting indicates the FBI had never taken her off its list before she died. By the time she died, the case had run for more than half a century. She had been free for 45 of those years, and the country that wanted her never got the chance to put her back on trial. Shakur's escape was loud and political, the kind millions of people still remember. The break that comes next made almost no noise at all. There was no ideology behind it, and no armed team storming the gates, just one man, a wooden box, and a plan so simple it's a wonder it worked. Glenn Stark Chambers. In February of 1990, a Florida inmate pulled off something almost no one has ever managed. He climbed inside a wooden box on the floor of a prison workshop, let another prisoner stack more boxes on top of him to hide him from view, and rode out through the gate on the back of a delivery truck. By the time anyone realized Glenn Stark Chambers was missing, that truck was already well on its way to Daytona Beach, and Chambers was gone with it. More than 3 decades later, investigators still believe he's out there, living quietly under a name that isn't his. The escape is only part of what makes his case unsettling. What lingers is how naturally he seems to have taken to a life spent hiding. Chambers was born in the spring of 1951, a tall man, well over 6 feet, with blue eyes, a 3-inch scar on his right forearm, and a tattoo that read, "Live free or die." He was also, by the accounts of the people who tracked him, unusually sharp. Behind bars, he joined Mensa, the high intelligence society, and taught himself to speak Spanish fluently. He even had the old tattoo covered over with a butterfly design, the kind of small, deliberate change that makes a man harder to place later. Investigators would point to all of it as proof that Chambers had both the mind and the tools to build a completely new life somewhere far away. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of person you do not want to lose. The crime that put him in prison was a personal one. On the 22nd of January, 1975, Chambers attacked his girlfriend, Connie Weeks, a 21-year-old woman who worked as a server at a Sarasota bowling alley. He assaulted her first in a parking lot, and then again at the apartment they shared, on the very night she had posted his bail to get him released. She suffered severe injuries and did not survive them. Her name is often lost in the retelling of the escape that came later, but she is the reason there was ever a case at all. If a jury looked at a crime that serious, why isn't Chambers on death row today? He nearly was. Chambers was convicted of first-degree murder, and the jury recommended a death sentence. But the case went up on appeal, and the Florida Supreme Court set that recommendation aside, reducing the sentence to life in prison. There is a grim irony in what followed. The mercy that spared his life is the same decision that placed him in the general prison population, in the kind of low-security work assignment that a man on death row would never have been given. He had reportedly tried to break out before, and failed. In February of 1990, he finally found the method that worked. At the time, Chambers was assigned to a furniture building work program at Polk Correctional Institution, and the plan turned on the very boxes the prisoners were producing. According to the state agent who worked the case for years, Chambers sealed himself inside one of those boxes, and another inmate helped stack more on top to conceal him. It took a strange kind of patience. He had to lie folded in the dark, trusting that no one would check too closely, that the weight above him would hold, and that the truck would actually leave. It did. The whole load was driven off prison grounds on a delivery run bound for Daytona Beach, and Chambers stepped off somewhere down the road, hours before anyone even knew to look for him. Once he was loose, the tips started coming in, and they never really stopped. Over the years, reported sightings placed Chambers along the Alabama coast, up in Canada, and as far away as New Zealand. Those sightings tell their own story. A man reported on the Gulf Coast one year and in another country the next is either impossibly mobile or impossible to actually identify. And after enough of them, investigators learned to treat every fresh tip with equal parts hope and doubt. His case was featured on national manhunt programs, including one hosted by John Walsh, which gave the segment the fitting title of The Escape Artist. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement and the United States Marshals kept the file open decade after decade, working leads that never quite closed the distance. Investigators came to believe he was most likely living overseas, using his fluent Spanish to pass as someone he wasn't. What stands out about Chambers is how completely the trail went cold the moment that truck cleared the gate. There was no getaway driver to trace and no accomplice on the outside that investigators could ever pin down. A man who could teach himself a language and earn his way into a high-intelligence society was more than capable of inventing a false past and holding himself to it, year after year, without a single slip that brought the police to his door. As of 2026, Glenn Stark Chambers has never been recaptured. He turned 75 in the spring of that year, which means the man authorities are still searching for is now elderly and has spent more than 35 years free, one of the longest-running fugitive cases in Florida's history. Somewhere, investigators believe, there is an old man with a quiet routine and an unremarkable life, and almost no one around him has any idea who he used to be. Chambers is thought to have stayed one step ahead by hiding behind a new identity, far from where anyone was looking. He wouldn't be the only person on this list to pull that off. But where he seems to have survived by having somewhere to run, the next fugitive did something even harder to catch. She survived by standing almost perfectly still. Sharon Kinney. When Sharon Kinney's husband was found dead of a gunshot in their Missouri home, she already had an explanation ready. She said one of her young children had found the gun and fired it by accident. And remarkably, the authorities believed her. It was the first of 3 deaths that would trail her across 2 countries, and the beginning of a story that wouldn't end for more than 60 years in a small town in Canada, with a warrant still open and a woman who had spent half a lifetime pretending to be someone else. To follow her story is to watch the justice system reach for her again and again, and come up empty almost every time. Sharon Kinney was a young wife and mother from Independence, Missouri, in the early 1960s. The sort of ordinary suburban figure no one looks at twice. That ordinariness turned out to be one of her most effective disguises. Over the decade that followed, she would be tied to the deaths of 3 people, and along the way, she would earn a nickname in the Mexican press, La Pistolera, the gunslinger. Her story has since been turned into a book and retold on true crime television. But behind all of it was someone the courts could never quite hold on to. The first death came in March of 1960. Her husband, James Kinney, was gone, and her account that a young child in the home had found the gun and caused it was accepted. So his death was ruled accidental. Only weeks later, in May, a woman named Patricia Jones lost her life. Jones was the wife of a car salesman Kinney had been romantically pursuing, and this time suspicion pointed squarely at Kinney. Then, in September of 1964, the story crossed the border. In a Mexico City hotel room, a man named Francisco Paredes Ordonez was fatally shot, and a small pistol found in Kinney's room was later matched, through ballistics, to the earlier death of Patricia Jones. The same weapon quietly tied 2 of the cases together across an international line. So with 3 deaths and a matching gun, how did Sharon Kinney keep slipping through the system's fingers? In the American courts, she did it by being acquitted. Kinney stood trial in the United States in connection with the deaths back home, and more than once she walked out without a conviction. Juries heard the evidence and let her go. The way the law finally caught up with her is almost the strangest part of the whole story. The American courts, the ones with every reason to want her, never managed to convict her of anything. The country that did was Mexico, where she had no home ground and no benefit of the doubt, and where that last shooting had happened. There she was convicted in the death of Ordonez and sentenced to 13 years in prison. A separate Missouri charge in her husband's death stayed open, and when she failed to appear for it, a warrant was issued that would sit unresolved for the better part of a century, becoming one of the longest outstanding homicide warrants in Kansas City history. She never came close to serving that Mexican sentence in full. On the 7th of December, 1969, roughly 5 years into her term, Kinney escaped from a Mexican women's prison and vanished, despite a nationwide manhunt. And then she did the most disciplined thing a fugitive can do. she stopped running. Early the following year, in February of 1970, she married a man named James Glabus in Los Angeles, took the name D. Glabus, and eventually settled into a small farming town in Alberta, Canada, called Taber. There she lived, for more than 50 years, as an unremarkable member of a quiet community. There were no dramatic sightings and no near misses. Just decades of ordinary life, built on top of a homicide warrant that had never gone away. For half a century, it held. The warrant back in Missouri never expired. But a warrant is only as good as the ability to act on it. And Keeney had put an international border and a brand new name between herself and everyone still looking. The detectives who had once chased her aged out of the case. Some retired and some died, and the woman at the center of it grew old in a place none of them ever thought to check. The truth only surfaced after her death. Acting on an anonymous tip received in late 2023, investigators in Missouri began pulling at the thread, and it led them to a woman named D. Glabus in Taber, Alberta, who had once been Sharon Kinney. At a news conference in January of 2025, the Kansas City Police Department and the Jackson County Sheriff's Office announced what they had found. Kinney had died of natural causes on the 21st of January, 2022, in that same Canadian town, where she had hidden in plain sight for over half a century. One of the investigators summed her up simply, saying she was very good at what she did, and that she had hidden extraordinarily well. With her death confirmed, the pending charges were formally dropped, and the case was officially closed. As of 2026, that is where it stands. Sharon Kinney was never recaptured, never extradited, and never made to answer in a courtroom for the warrant that chased her for 50 years. She simply outlived it, in a town most people had never heard of, under a name that was never really hers. Not subscribed yet? Now's the time. And if audio's more your thing, find us on Spotify too. You can click the link in our bio. Monroe Hickson. In the fall of 1957, a South Carolina inmate sitting in a cell for an unrelated assault suddenly began telling his jailers something no one had asked him about. He said he was the man responsible for a string of unsolved killings in the small town of Aiken more than a decade earlier, killings that another man had already been sentenced to die for. When investigators went back through the case files and checked what he was telling them, every piece of it lined up. His name was Monroe Hickson, and he was a serial killer no one had been looking for. His story doesn't end there. Almost 10 years after that confession, Hickson walked out of a South Carolina prison and vanished. The FBI added him to its 10 most wanted fugitives list. He was never brought back. And the answer to what had happened to him only came in through a couple in North Carolina months later, looking at his face on a wanted poster and realizing they had already buried him. To understand how one man could stay hidden that long and take a nearly executed innocent man with him into the record, you have to start in a small town in the American South in the years right after the Second World War. Monroe Hickson was born in the summer of 1908. He had no formal education, but the people who came into contact with him remembered him as unusually intelligent and deeply, almost obsessively religious. He carried a Bible with him wherever he went and read it constantly. Between April and October of 1946, 4 people in Aiken, South Carolina lost their lives in a string of shootings, and 1 more survived an attempt on their own. The cases sat there, unsolved, for years. And then, in 1947, another man, L.D. Harris, was arrested for 2 of those killings, put on trial, convicted, and sentenced to die in the electric chair. if Hickson was the man who had actually done it? How did the wrong person get sent to death row? The answer is that the case against Harris was thin from the start, and the courts eventually noticed. His conviction was overturned on appeal in 1949. Harris walked out with his life intact, but for the next 8 years, no one in Aiken had any idea who was actually behind those killings. The town had a serial killer it did not know existed. That changed in 1957. Hickson was picked up on an unrelated assault charge, and while he was in custody, something in him gave way. He started confessing, first to one of the Aiken killings, and then to another, and then to more. When investigators laid the details from those confessions next to the old evidence, everything fit. The information he was giving them was too accurate to be a fantasy, and it lined up with cases the public had long since forgotten about. Monroe Hickson was formally charged, convicted, and sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms. The Aiken cases, which had sat cold in a file cabinet for more than a decade, were finally closed. For L.D. Harris, the man who had come so close to being put to death for 2 of those killings, the confessions arrived far too late to undo the years he had already lost. He had been exonerated on appeal, but no court order can hand back the time a person spends waiting for the state to end their life. By any reasonable measure, that should have been the end of his story. But Hickson had one more move in him. In 1966, roughly 9 years into those sentences, he walked out of Manning Correctional Institution in South Carolina and disappeared. Prison records from that era are thin, and the exact mechanics of how he got past the walls have never been fully explained. What is known is where the trail led afterward, and how completely he faded into the background of another state. On the 17th of February, 1967, the FBI added Monroe Hickson to its 10 most wanted fugitives list. His face went up in post offices and government buildings across the country. Somewhere in North Carolina, a couple in the town of Chapel Hill happened to see it. They looked at the photograph, and they recognized the man staring back at them. They knew him as a quiet migrant farm worker who had come through the area and kept mostly to himself. They also knew him because they had recently helped bury him. Monroe Hickson had died of natural causes on the 29th of December, 1967, without ever being recaptured, and without anyone in law enforcement knowing that the wanted man they were looking for was already in the ground. Fingerprint records confirmed the identification in 1968. The FBI closed the file. What was left afterward was a case that quietly answered one question and left another hanging in the air. The killer had been found, in about the strangest way a case can be closed. But an innocent man had come within one appeals ruling of being executed for what Hickson had done, and no paperwork after the fact could give L.D. Harris back the years he had spent staring at a death sentence for crimes he had nothing to do with. As of 2026, Monroe Hickson remains one of the more unsettling closed cases in FBI history. He died a fugitive, an aging farm worker known to almost no one under his real name. And the people who ultimately made the identification were ordinary strangers who happened to see his face on a poster. Hickson slipped away into a quiet life somewhere else in the South and finished it before the law ever caught up with him. The next fugitive on this list took a much louder way out. He didn't disappear into a farm town in another state. He walked onto a commercial airliner, held a gun on the crew, and forced them to fly him to a country the United States couldn't reach him in. Ishmael Labit. On the last day of December, 1984, a convicted mass killer named Ishmael Labit was being flown from the Virgin Islands, back to a mainland prison in the United States. Somewhere over the Atlantic, he stood up, made his way to the lavatory of the commercial airliner he was on, and returned with a handgun. What happened next is one of the strangest hijackings in American aviation history. No one was hurt. When the plane finally landed, it did so in Havana, hundreds of miles off its filed course. More than 40 years later, Labit has never been sent back. To understand how one man managed to redirect a commercial flight to another country and walk away from a life sentence in the process, you have to go back to the reason he was on that plane in the first place. Ismail Labit was born on the island of St. Croix in the United States Virgin Islands, to a local mother and a German father. He served in the United States Army during the Vietnam War before returning home to the Caribbean. What came after that service is the reason his name is on any list of American fugitives at all. On the 6th of September, 1972, 5 armed men walked onto the grounds of the Fountain Valley Golf Course on St. Croix and opened fire. When the shooting stopped, 8 people were dead, tourists and resort employees, and as many as 8 more were wounded. It was one of the worst mass killings in the history of the United States Virgin Islands, and it devastated the island's tourism industry for years afterward. Investigators identified Labit as the ringleader. If the case looked that clear-cut, why has his guilt been argued over for more than 50 years since? The answer runs through a courtroom in 1973. All 5 of the accused men, including Labit, went on trial in the District Court of the Virgin Islands. The defense team, which at one point included the well-known civil rights attorney William Kunstler, argued that the confessions the prosecution was relying on had been coerced through torture. Fights broke out inside the courtroom. The whole proceeding carried strong racial overtones. 7 of the 8 victims had been white. The defendants were Afro-Caribbean, and the case landed in the middle of a period of deep unrest across the islands. In August of 1973, all 5 men were convicted. Each was sentenced to 8 consecutive life terms, and the convictions were upheld on appeal the following year. The co-defendants convicted alongside Labit were named Beaumont Giraud, Morale Smith, Warren Ballantyne, and Raphael Joseph, and their fates would diverge sharply from his over the decades that followed. For Labit, that should have meant spending the rest of his life inside an American prison. But in December of 1984, he was returned to St. Croix for a court appearance on a separate civil suit he had filed. And on the trip back to the mainland, the plan he seems to have been building for years suddenly went into motion. The flight was American Airlines 626. Somewhere along the route, Labit retrieved a handgun that had been hidden in the aircraft's lavatory. How exactly it got there has never been fully answered, and used it to force the pilots to change course for Havana. No shots were fired. No passenger was hurt. The plane landed on Cuban soil, and Ismail Labit stepped off it as a free man. Cuba's response was not quite what he might have hoped for. The Cuban government prosecuted him for the hijacking itself, since even a country that had no love for the American justice system was not about to allow commercial airliners to be commandeered into its airspace at gunpoint. By Labit's own later account, he served roughly 7 years of a 10-year sentence before being released for good behavior. From that point on, he became part of Cuban life. He was given a ration book and an apartment. He learned to live the way the people around him lived. He took the name Ismail Muslim Ali, and to acquaintances he became, in a word, Cubanized. He would eventually break his long silence. In a documentary released in 2016 called The Skyjacker's Tale, Labit gave his first public interview in decades. He continued to deny any involvement in the shooting at Fountain Valley. Whether people believed him depended, as it always had, on where they stood on the case to begin with. There is one more strange piece to the Fountain Valley story that outlived the case itself. Years before the massacre, a musician named Sherman Kelly said he had been beaten by some of the same men who would later carry it out. In the aftermath of that assault, Kelly sat down and wrote a song about a peaceful, safer world, where nothing like that would ever happen. A song that became the enduring 1970s hit Dancing in the Moonlight. Most of the people who have sung along to it over the years have no idea what history it came from. As of 2026, Ishmael Labit is believed to be alive and still living in Cuba, in Holguin province, an elderly man in a country the United States has never been able to extract him from. He was never sent back and never recaptured. Of the 5 men convicted in 1973, one was granted clemency in the early 1990s and later died. The other 3 remain in American prisons. Labit is the one who got away, and after 40 years in Havana, he has almost certainly stayed away for good. Labit stayed free because a foreign government decided it would not send him back. The next fugitive on this list vanished for a completely different reason. He wasn't hidden by a country. He was, if the historians are right, hidden by his own side and hidden permanently. Frederick J. Tenuto. Frederick J. Tenuto escaped from a Pennsylvania prison in 1947, and for the next 14 years, he stayed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, longer than anyone else on that roster had at the time. He was never caught, and he was never seen again. When the FBI finally took him off the list in 1964, they did so because they had come to believe something much darker than a successful escape. They believed Tenuto had been murdered, killed on the orders of one of the leading mob bosses in America at the time, to make sure he could never tell anyone what he knew. To understand how one man could disappear that completely, and why the people he had worked for had reason to make him vanish, you have to look at what he had done, and who he had done it for. Tenuto was born in Philadelphia in the winter of 1915. He had a criminal record by the age of 16 and never really stopped adding to it. By the 1940s, according to police, he was working as a contract killer, taking quiet, discreet jobs on behalf of organized crime figures. A police psychiatrist who interviewed him once described him as the kind of man who could take a life in one room and calmly sit down to a meal in the next. The underworld nickname he picked up along the way was the Angel of Death. In 1940, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in what was reportedly a contract killing of a Philadelphia man. He was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in state prison. That should have been the end of his career. It wasn't. Tenuto had escaped from custody at least once in the years before, been recaptured, and been put back inside. He was, by any measure, a difficult man to hold. But the one break that mattered, the one no one ever undid, was still to come. If a man like Tenuto could be kept behind bars, this case would look very different. So how did he get out? The answer is that he did, more than once. But the escape that mattered came on the 10th of February, 1947. On that day, Tenuto and 4 other inmates broke out of Philadelphia County Prison at Holmesburg. Among the men who went out with him was a name any student of American crime knows: Willie Sutton, the bank robber the press had nicknamed the actor for his talent at disguises. Sutton would eventually be recaptured. Tenuto would not. For 3 years, he stayed off the FBI's radar entirely. Then, on the 24th of May, 1950, his name went up on the Bureau's 10 most wanted fugitives list. He was the 14th man ever added to it, and for the next 14 years, he stayed on it. the longest listing on record for anyone up to that point. Then came the piece of the story that pulled Tenuto into a much larger world. On the 8th of March, 1952, a young Brooklyn man named Arnold Schuster was gunned down on the street near his home. Schuster had recently made headlines for helping police locate Willie Sutton after spotting him on the subway and following him long enough to tip off officers. It was the kind of small, ordinary act of civic assistance that ends up on the front page for a day or two and then fades. Schuster never got the chance to enjoy the recognition. According to law enforcement and later reporting, his death was ordered by the mob boss, Albert Anastasia, who was said to be furious that a private citizen had informed on a criminal from his world. A witness would later identify Tenuto as the man seen leaving the scene. If the account is right, Tenuto had just carried out one of the most notorious mob killings of the era. And that, according to the theory the FBI and organized crime historians eventually settled on, is exactly what got him killed himself. An assassin who has just carried out a high-profile hit for a boss like Anastasia is a walking piece of evidence. He knows names, he knows dates, and he knows who gave the order. The safest way to make sure none of that ever reaches a courtroom is to make the assassin himself disappear. In the years that followed the Schuster killing, no one in the underworld ever heard from Frederick Tenuto again. No body was ever recovered. One persistent piece of mob folklore claims that his remains were hidden in the false bottom of another man's coffin, a so-called double-decker funeral, buried in plain sight beneath someone whose paperwork was in order. Whatever actually happened, by 1964, the FBI had heard enough. On the 9th of March that year, they formally removed him from the 10 most wanted list. The Bureau's language was cautious, as it had to be, since there was no proof, only rumor and pattern. But the reasoning was clear. They no longer believed there was a fugitive out there for them to catch. As of 2026, Frederick Tenuto has never been officially declared dead by American courts, and the details of his fate have never been formally proven. What is certain is that no one who knew him ever saw him alive again after the early 1950s. And the underworld he worked for treated him as a closed matter for the next 7 decades. He escaped a Pennsylvania prison in 1947. If the historians are right, he was silenced somewhere in New York less than 5 years later. Tenuto is thought to have paid the ultimate price for the very connections that had once protected him. The final fugitive on this list survived by a completely different kind of network. He came from wealth, and that wealth would eventually arrange for him a getaway that no one on record had ever quite attempted before. Joel David Kaplan. On the 18th of August, 1971, during the middle of a movie screening inside a Mexican prison, guards heard something no one in the yard had expected to hear: the sound of helicopter blades coming in low over the walls. It was a Bell 47, painted a shade of blue that made it almost identical to the helicopter used by Mexico's own Attorney General. It landed in the exercise yard, in full view of the inmates and the staff. 2 men climbed on board. Under 2 minutes later, it was gone. And one of them, an American named Joel David Kaplan, had just executed one of the earliest helicopter prison breaks in history. It is the kind of escape that would eventually be turned into a Hollywood movie. What is less well known is what happened after. Kaplan flew home to the United States, quietly settled into a private life, and lived out his remaining 17 years in Miami without ever being extradited, put on trial again, or brought back into a Mexican courtroom. When he died in 1988, the case died with him. To understand how any of that was possible, you have to start with who he was and who was standing behind him. Joel David Kaplan came from serious money. He was the nephew of Jacob M. Kaplan, a molasses, sugar, and grape juice magnate, whose philanthropic foundation, the J. M. Kaplan Fund, had been named in a 1964 congressional investigation as a channel through which the CIA had funneled money into Latin America. The younger Kaplan was a businessman in his own right, and by the early 1960s, that work had taken him deep into Mexico, where he had a business partner named Luis Vidal Jr. Vidal had a complicated life of his own, reportedly tied to arms trafficking, and in the early 1960s, he turned up dead. Mexican authorities arrested and charged Joel Kaplan with his death. Kaplan insisted he was innocent. He said he had been in Peru at the time, and he went further than that, arguing that the body Mexican authorities had recovered was not even Vidal's to begin with. There were, according to journalists who covered the case later, genuine reasons to doubt the identification of the corpse. If the case against him was that shaky, how did Kaplan still end up serving nearly 10 years in a Mexican prison for it? Because Mexican courts convicted him anyway. The sentence was reported at somewhere between 27 and 28 years. In September of 1967, the Mexican Supreme Court denied his final appeal. Kaplan was sent to the Santa Marta Acatitla Penitentiary in Mexico City, and by every ordinary measure, he was going to spend the rest of his life inside its walls. His family disagreed. His sister Judy Kaplan, working alongside an American smuggler named Victor Statter, began putting together something that no one had ever really attempted at scale: a helicopter extraction from an active prison. They hired a Vietnam veteran pilot named Roger Hirschner. They bought a Bell 47. They painted it blue in the specific shade used by Mexico's Attorney General, so that any guard who happened to glance up would assume for a critical few seconds that whatever was landing had the right to land. On the 18th of August, 1971, most of the prison's guards were watching a movie with the inmates when the helicopter came in over the walls. It touched down in the yard. Kaplan and his cellmate, a Venezuelan counterfeiter named Carlos Antonio Contreras Castro, climbed aboard. In under 2 minutes, they were airborne. Not a shot was fired. The helicopter took them out of the prison. From there, they transferred to a plane, which flew them across the border and into the United States. In Mexico, Kaplan was now a fugitive. What his status was under American law was a much stranger question. Because what happened next, or rather, what didn't happen, is the part that makes this case unlike any other on this list. Mexico did arrest and question the prison staff, and its own attorney general was forced to resign over the incident. But the country never initiated formal extradition proceedings against Kaplan. American authorities, on their end, never pursued him either. Kaplan's own lawyer offered a legal argument that helped explain the silence. Under Mexican law at the time, a prison break was only technically a crime if it involved violence against staff or property, or if prison employees had helped. Neither had happened here. In legal terms, the flight over the walls didn't fit neatly into anything the courts wanted to touch. The story would eventually be turned into a best-selling book called The 10-Second Jailbreak and, in 1975, into a Hollywood film called Breakout, starring Charles Bronson. Rumors also persisted, though never proven, that the whole rescue had been quietly assisted by the CIA, given the family's history of involvement with intelligence-linked funding. Kaplan's own lawyer told reporters that his client was, in fact, a CIA operative, a claim the family dismissed. Whatever the truth of that was, Kaplan spent the remainder of his life in the United States, mostly in Miami. He lived quietly, reportedly going deaf in his later years, and by the time he died, on the 15th of June, 1988, according to Spanish-language reporting on the case, he was still a wealthy man, though he was living alone. His uncle, the philanthropist, had died the year before. As of 2026, Joel David Kaplan remains the only person on this list to have escaped a foreign prison by air, and one of the very few fugitives in modern history for whom the country that lost him never even asked for him back. He was never recaptured, never extradited, and never made to answer again for a case whose evidence he denied to the end. 8 escapes, spread across 70 years and half the world, and every one of them ended without the ring of a cell door closing behind the fugitive again. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.